Joining us now, Richard Reeves. He's a senior fellow with the Brookings Institute and is the author of a very interesting new book, Of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. Richard, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on.
He's also the author of a great book, Dream Hoarders. We were just talking about that. Phenomenal book. I highly recommend. We'll have links down in the description for you guys to go ahead and buy it. So, Richard, first of all, why did you decide to write this book? And what were the social kind of impetus and why you thought it was important to society to have this conversation?
Well, the first thing to say is I've raised 3 boys myself to adulthood, and I think all scholarship is a little bit autobiographical.
Yep.
It's a question of whether we admit it or not.
Yeah.
My last book, Dream Hoarders, was partly about the experience of being in the American upper middle class.
Right.
This is the experience of raising boys. But actually, in my day job, so I'm worried about boys at night because I've got 3, but in my day job, as I was working on issues of inequality in education, in employment, in the family, I just kept running across this gender gap, and not the way you'd expect to see it. I kept seeing ways in which it was boys and men who are really struggling. To be clear, it's mostly working class boys and men, black boys and men. It's typically not the dream hoarders. It's not the upper middle class. But I don't think we can understand inequality in the US without understanding what's happening to boys and men. I also felt, frankly, there was a bit of a gap because both sides politically are so dug in the culture wars around issues of sex and gender that it's even hard to have a book with that title without getting a reaction from people.
Yeah.
And so I almost felt like, as a Brookings scholar, given the work I've done, that trying to create a better conversation. We need a better conversation about re-scripting masculinity than we're currently getting, and this book is my attempt to do that.
Fascinating.
So part of why you get that pushback is because when we look around at society, you say, all right, look at the US Congress, still overwhelmingly male. We've still only had men as presidents. You look at the CEOs, they're like, there's some stat, there's like more CEOs named Bob than there are female CEOs or something like that. I think you've talked about, venture capital and what a small proportion of that goes to female founders. So when you look at those things and then you're like, yeah, but the real problem is with men, I can imagine why people are like, well, wait a second. It seems like the issue is on the other side. So how do you sort of square that circle?
Yeah, well, it depends where you're looking.
Yeah.
If you're looking around the apex of society and you're looking at those sorts of institutions, then clearly there's much further to go. And I've written about the need to get more women into Congress. The US is a real laggard on that front. And as for not having a female president yet, as you can probably tell, I come from the UK and we're on our 3rd female prime minister. And
this one doesn't seem to be working out so well. We'll just put that aside.
Have me back another day.
Yes,
but the point was, like, it was just no big deal.
Yeah.
And you're right, in Fortune 500 companies, only 44 of them are led by women right now. Now, go back 20 years and it was 0. So that's 44 more than it used to be, but it's very, very far from parity. But if we look down at what's happening in the rest of society, most American men today earn less than most American men did in 1979.
Yes.
There's a huge gender gap in education. Men are 3 times more likely to die from a death of despair, from alcohol, suicide, drug overdose. And so the trouble is that people who are just living in these elite circles look around and go, well, I don't see it. And so, well, partly it might be there and you're not seeing it, but also just look down. Look at the rest of society. We've seen such a big increase in economic inequality that we have to think about both those things at once. And partly this book is a challenge to say, can we think 2 things at once? Can we think there's much more to do for women in certain sectors of society, but now we also need to look at boys and men. And right now, it's proving very difficult to have that conversation.
Even breaking into that paradigm is just so tremendously hard. As you said, without getting coded, right wing. I've almost frankly given up, so I admire you for being able to try to fight the good fight. Point to some of the important data that you're saying there about the lifespan, about overall earnings, about deaths of despair, and why should women care about it? Why should women care about how men are doing in society?
Yeah, so in education, I think just to put a few data points on it, we've long worried about gender inequality in education, but it's typically been worrying about getting girls and women to catch up with boys and men. And so in 1972, the US passed the famous Title IX legislation to try and get more girls and women into college in particular. And at that point, men were about 13 percentage points more likely to get a college degree than women. Today, it's 15 percentage points more likely that a woman will get it than a man.
Wow.
So the gender gap is actually bigger in college education today than when Title IX was passed. It's just the other way around. It's flipped. If we look at high school GPA, you've got a high schooler, and I've had some recently. high school GPA is a really good measure because A, it's increasingly important in college admissions, and B, it's quite a good proxy for overall success. Let's look at high school GPA. The top performers in terms of high school GPA, those in the top 10%, destined for good colleges, 2/3 girls. The bottom 10%, 2/3 boys. And that is actually found in pretty much every country in the world, pretty much every level of the education system. So a massive reversal in the gender gap in education. What that means is that struggling to hit the labour market in the employment, you've talked a lot about this.
Yes.
In automation, free trade, like what's happened to the working class men. Working class men can't get the jobs their dad got with the same level of education. And so this has been a really difficult adjustment for men in the labour market. And one of the consequences of that is for family formation.
Yes.
So we see a number of men now who effectively get benched because they're not fulfilling the traditional male role. We haven't re-scripted a role for them. And so they end up out of touch with their kids' lives, which is particularly bad for their sons, actually.
That's one of the things I think is most important is, you know, especially I think in American society, we have this concept of masculinity that is centered around being the breadwinner.
Correct.
And then when you make it more and more difficult to fulfill that role, it's like, okay, well, what am I then? You know, what is the role that I'm supposed to, or am I just a failure? Like, am I terrible? And that opens up a window for people who maybe don't have the best messaging to come and say, well, it's these, I was going to say these B words, but
Yes.
We can't say that.
it's these ladies over here who are really your problem. Yeah.
It's the feminists' fault.
not nice.
That's right. It's the feminist's fault. There you go.
And that's exactly the debate we're having right now.
Right.
And I think what we see on the left is an unwillingness to acknowledge some of these issues at all, for fear that means betraying your commitment to women, which we've already talked about. But on the right, there's this sort of magical thinking, which is, let's go back to the way things used to be. Let's go back to the way men and women knew their place and to marriages based on economic dependency. We live in a world now where 40% of women earn more than the average man.
Right.
That was 13% in 1979. And so 41% of households have a female breadwinner. This has been a huge change. And a wonderful change, arguably the biggest economic liberation in human history. What it means, though, is that old model of masculinity, out of masculine success, is not coming back. And politicians on the right, who somehow think they can wave a magic wand and bring it back, are selling everyone a lie. So the left are effectively turning their backs on boys and men, but the right are trying to turn back the clock on women and girls. And everybody I know is just trying to figure this out. And we need a model of mature masculinity that is compatible with gender equality.
One of the things I think is important about your book is you actually offer some potential solutions. So let's talk about it. Some of the things that you offer, societal-wide changes that could be piloted or at the very least thought about experimenting in America.
Well, first of all, thank you for asking that question.
Yeah,
because I do think books suffer sometimes from they become like the Book of Lamentations.
Yes.
Everything that's wrong with the world, and then maybe one idea at the end. So I felt I did want to offer some solutions. So in education, for example, I have 3 ideas. One is that we should start boys in school a year later than girls because their brains mature later. A 16-year-old boy and a 16-year-old girl, I think you have a 14-year-old?
Yes.
And I've raised them, they're not the same. We know that boys' brains develop more slowly, which is one of the reasons for those GPA gaps we've talked about. So start them, redshirt them, is sometimes how it's described. We need a massive recruitment drive of male teachers. I think the fact that the teaching profession is becoming progressively more female is a problem. 24% of K-12 teachers now are men, only 1 in 10 elementary school teachers, and getting fewer by the year.
Interesting.
And that does seem to have an effect on boys, especially in subjects like English. And then we need more vocational education, a big investment in apprenticeships and VOTech and so on, which do seem to help boys and men a little bit more. So there's always focus on college. There's a unitary path and loan forgiveness, which again, I know you've talked about. But meanwhile, what we see for boys is that hands-on learning seems to work better for them. And so just in education, those are the sorts of ideas that I'm offering.
Sure.
One thing that I thought is, so I don't necessarily, in fact, I don't agree with this, but what would you say to people who are basically like, okay, you opened up the education, you made it so that women could compete. Women are competing, and actually they're better at this than boys. What's the problem? This is supposed to be a grand meritocracy, and now you want to do like affirmative action for boys to like tilt the system in their favor? That doesn't seem fair.
Well, it's actually, I half agree with you, even if you don't completely agree with you, because that's exactly what's happened. What's happened in education is that we've created a playing field which is much more even. And what that's demonstrated is that actually women and girls are at a structural advantage in the education system. So we've created a level playing field, and it turns out that the women and girls are better players. But they're better players largely because of the developmental differences, because their brains develop earlier, and especially the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is a bit of your brain that says, do your chemistry homework rather than going out to party. Maybe you should care about your GPA because that will help you get into college. It's about future orientation. It's about the ability to control yourself, and it just develops a year or two later in boys than girls. And so I actually think that we're seeing one of the great ironies is that by taking the brakes off girls and women in the education system, we've revealed the structural advantages they had all along. We couldn't see it because they weren't going to college.
Right.
Under conditions of sexism, we couldn't see the advantages that girls and women had in education. And nobody expected this overtaking, by the way. If you go back to the 70s when everyone was pushing hard, correctly, for girls and women to do better, nobody said, well, wait, what if the lines keep going? And does it matter? Well, to the extent that education matters, increasingly in the modern economy, I think we should be worried about any inequalities by group, whether that's race, gender, etc. So I don't think on its face there's any reason to be more relaxed about the gender gap now than in the 1970s, just because it's the other way around.
Well, something you alluded to also is at the individual level, parenting. What do you think, if any, changes need to come to the way that people parent, especially in either like a mixed gender household or in your case, if you have 3 boys, like what should at the individual level, at the end of the day, we could talk about solutions. We have a lot of people listening to this show, maybe they have kids. What should they be thinking about with regards to your book?
Well, I think the first thing is something not to do. And I think that's not to fall into the trap of thinking there's something toxic about masculinity. I do think that this term toxic masculinity has become itself toxic, frankly, because the message that society is then sending, which I think parents can absorb and inadvertently maybe pass on, is there's something wrong with you. And so if you're behaving in a particular way, which on average is more associated with being male, then I think that to pathologize that, say physicality or more potential for aggression and so on, is not the way to help boys learn to manage that. So recognize there are some differences between them. It's a myth, there are no differences. Absolutely you want equality of opportunity for both. Interestingly now, there's some evidence that people are starting to think it's more important for their girls to get a good education than their boys. And that's not true. And I'm very worried that in some households, and this seems to be particularly true in more working class households, that educational success itself is being seen as more feminine. And it's incredibly important to send a message to the boys that actually you succeeding at school, you having chances at college or apprenticeships is just as important as your sister. It feels weird to be saying this, even now, because it's so recent. But the educational overtaking is so fast and so recent that honestly our heads are spinning. It's like the poles on a compass reversing. Like north became south overnight. And so I understand why we're all struggling. I've struggled with it, frankly, as I've been writing the book. But the evidence is pretty clear now that if we're worried about education, we need to worry about boys.
So if the old story we've told about like what it means to be a man is not functioning well in society, what does a new story sound like? Yeah,
we definitely need a new script for masculinity. I think that what's happened for women, I'd be interested to know if you agree with this, is there was an old script which was get married, get kids, have a stable family, etc. I'm simplifying. The new script is get educated, get yourself independent, make sure you can take care of yourself. You go, girl, right? Make sure you can stand on your own feet. Very strong script. So we've replaced an old script with a new script for women. The old script for men, become a breadwinner, look after your family. The new script for men, not sure yet. And that's the problem. And so a re-scripted, positive vision of masculinity has to be founded on, I think, some things that sound quite old, which is you do provide for your kids, but not just money, time and care, etc. So I think we need to start with fatherhood. The danger is that as the old model of masculinity has collapsed in the face of the changes that we've just mentioned, is that fathers get benched. The message that they get from themselves very often, and from women and from society, is you failed as a breadwinner, ergo you don't matter as a father. That's absolutely the opposite of the truth. And so we need equal paid leave for fathers. Fathers who are not married to mothers need much stronger rights than they currently get. We have to send a message through policy and through rhetoric that fathers matter, period. Go back to the speech Barack Obama gave in 2008 about the importance of fathers.
That's right.
He was
actually a great
on
speech.
the money, absolutely on the money, and didn't really touch it again since. And so I don't think we're going to reconstitute marriage in the way that conservatives think we can, but we need to put fatherhood back on a pedestal, just a new kind of pedestal.
That's what I love about your work. You're trying to reform and, recognize the realities, the social progresses we made, and not diminish them in any way, but just say, no, we need to find a new equilibrium, and that isn't always rooted in like being a 1960s individual.
Yeah.
You don't have to go back to go forward.
Yes.
Well, and I did want to ask you one other social trend that I actually did a monologue on, which is that far fewer young people, either Democrat or Republican, are identifying as feminists now.
Correct. That's right.
Yes,
I saw your thing on that. It's
you
very
did?
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Why did you think that? What did you make of that trend?
What's happened, I think, is that there's a few things. One is a lot of boys are hearing the message that we live in a patriarchy, we need feminism, etc., and they're looking around and going, wait, what?
Yep.
This is not the world that they're experiencing, and so they're struggling to fit the rhetoric about patriarchy and gender equality with their own lived experience. I think that's one thing.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is that feminism has morphed into more of a cultural movement.
Yeah.
For some
But
good
it's
reasons.
not just boys; it's women too, who younger women much less likely than their older counterparts to identify as feminists.
Yeah, and there is some polling, I can't remember if you mentioned this in your monologue, but they dug into why don't you say you're a feminist? And there were, feminism's gone too far. Today's feminism doesn't represent true feminism, and feminism has become anti-men. And so I think that feminism at its best is an equality movement.
Yes.
It's an equality movement and a liberation movement. And to the extent that if you ask people, do you think that women and girls should have equal opportunities to men and boys, everyone says yes.
Of course,
Everyone says yes. And if there are remaining barriers to women and girls succeeding, should we take those barriers down? Everyone says yes. So they're clearly not thinking that's what feminism is. And instead they're seeing feminism more of this cultural movement, which has taken on some of the aura of anti-men, toxic masculinity, etc., and I think has been a bit blind to some of the problems that boys and men are now facing. That creates, as you alluded to earlier, a massive opening for other people to come in.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I encourage everybody to go buy the book. It's right here. We're going to have a link down in the description. Go ahead and purchase it. And I think supporting people like you who do this work in a very measured
very
way,
thoughtful.
with data, thoughtful, no culture war or any of that is just the most important thing. So go ahead and support Richard if you can. Link is in the description. Otherwise, we will see you all next week. We've got the counterpoints tomorrow. Go ahead and take advantage of the discount if you can. Live show, yada, yada. You guys know all of that. We'll see you guys later.
Love y'all. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.